In this episode, we'll take a look at a classic broadcast dynamic microphone, the Electro-Voice RE20. And this entire episode is being recorded with the RE20 into a Sound Devices Mix-Pre 3 audio recorder so that you can hear what it sounds like. First, let's get you some audio samples that include the RE20 and the SHURE SM7B and the Earthworks ETHOS, two other broadcast-style microphones, on three different voices. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
And here are a variety of other samples and tests. Plosives are the sound you get when someone says the letter P or B. A little puff of air comes out of your mouth and goes directly onto the microphone capsule. Let's test to see how that does here. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. And then I'll talk just past the microphone here. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Next up, sibilance. Sibilance is the sizzling sound that the voice makes when someone says the letter S or C. Some voices have a lot more of it. My voice tends to have quite a lot of it. Here's a sample. She sells seashells by the seashore. By the seashore, she sells seashells. The microphone clip that comes with the microphone is no sort of shock mounting whatsoever. There is some internal shock mounting, but let's see what happens when I bump the stand and the microphone itself. The RE20 does have a high-pass filter. It sounds like, at least based on the specs, that it's fairly extreme. It starts as early as 400 hertz and starts rolling off, but let's see how it sounds. So right now it is currently off, and this is what the RE20 sounds like. And this is with the high-pass filter turned on so that you can get a sample of what that sounds like relative to no high-pass filter. So it should thin out my voice a little bit, make things a little bit not quite so big on the bottom end, if you will, and that's what it sounds like. Let's go ahead and switch it back off. And here we are with the high-pass filter turned off again on the Electro-Voice RE20. Here's a sample of off-axis coloration. So I'm talking directly into the microphone first. Let's go ahead and turn so that we're talking into the side of the microphone. We're now 90 degrees off-axis, and if I continue to turn more, we are now 180 degrees off-axis. Coming back to the microphone at 90 degrees off-axis, and then back onto the front of the microphone at 0 degrees off-axis. The idea here is to see how my voice changes, not only in terms of the overall levels, but also the coloration. Does it change the timbre in any way when we get to the back? Okay, let's cover the pros first. Number one, I think you've probably gathered already. As a broadcast dynamic microphone, this has a really nice, rich low end that seems fairly well controlled. If you have someone with a really deep voice, it could be a little bit boomy, woolly, perhaps. And so that's one thing to watch out for. But I think for most people's voices, if you're looking for that broadcast sound, this microphone clearly delivers. Now, it also has a better, I think, high-frequency response, a crisper sound to it than a lot of other broadcast dynamic microphones, specifically the SHURE SM7B. So that's where this one shines a little bit more, if that's what you're looking for. The build of this microphone is pretty legendary as well. Rock solid steel, feels really solid. You're not going to have problems with that. And in fact, that also helps with RF immunity. That is to say, you're not going to get a lot of radio frequency or electromagnetic interference with this. And especially here, we did an RF test where we held a phone up to it with LTE, with Wi-Fi, and also a wireless transmitter, microphone transmitter set to 524.200 megahertz we didn't pick up any sort of electromagnetic or RF interference. So this microphone and its build definitely prevent any of those sort of problems. As you saw in some of the earlier samples as well, the variable D design also helps with plosives somewhat. You're still going to have to use good microphone technique. And you'll notice, for example, here I have it off to the side, aimed at my mouth at 45 degrees. And the idea with that is that I talk just past it so I don't get a lot of those plosive issues. And the microphone's design itself also helps prevent that to some extent. It also helps some with proximity effect. If I get up really, really close on the microphone here, you can notice that it's picking up, it's more sensitive in the lower frequencies now, even though it's louder, but it's also more sensitive in the lower frequencies. And this handles that better than a lot of the other microphones I've experienced. Also has a high-pass filter, which helps manage boominess, especially with deeper voices. And I was worried about this high-pass filter at first because it starts to cut in at about 400 hertz, which is pretty high. Like that's cutting into most people's voices. But when we turned it on, it didn't seem to create a lot of problems for us. It was fairly mild, and so it just does a nice job of removing some of that boominess without making the microphone sound really thin. The microphone does very, very well in terms of self-noise, and the way we measure that is with our kind of practical noise floor test. It's not as scientific, it's a very practical test, but what we do is we come into this quiet space, turn everything off, record me just speaking into the microphone, and then I leave a period of about 5 to 10 seconds with no talking. And then we measure that in post. So we bring it in, we normalize to minus 23 LUFS, so we're at a standard level, so we can compare microphone to microphone. And in this case, it came in, the silent portion came in at minus 65 dB RMS max without a high-pass filter. Then if we added a high-pass filter in post at 65 hertz with 24 dB per octave cut, we came in at minus 77.6 dB RMS, which is absolutely fantastic. So this microphone does great in terms of self-noise. You're not going to get a lot of that hissing and other noise that you have to work with. Now, of course, you're going to have to use a good preamplifier as well to get those great results. In this case, we're using a mixed pre, but it's not the microphone that's going to be contributing a whole bunch of that hiss. This microphone can be used for almost anything. If you are recording instruments and other things like that, there are plenty of these in recording studios for good reason. They just work really, really well in lots of situations. So it's sort of the mic you can buy once and it will last your entire career. It also does have a 3-year US warranty. Now, I do want to tell you a story. I've had this microphone since, I believe, 2014 or 15. So I've had it for at least 7, maybe 8 years now. And when I had it, I think I'd had it for about 9 months and it stopped working. I would just get a bunch of noise when I plugged it in. So I sent it back to Electro-Voice. They repaired it, sent it right back to me. No problem since then, so the warranty coverage was really, really great. So I haven't had any problems with it since then, so we've got 7 years of flawless performance since then, and just wanted to let you know that. I bought this with my own money. Nobody's sponsoring me to make this video, so I don't have any reason to sugarcoat this. Now, are there some cons? I think everything has its downsides. I would say that this microphone's, the included clip has no shock mounting, and when you do bump the stand, that transfers into the microphone, and you get a very low frequency kind of boom, and in some cases, some really heavy resonances. So you're going to have to be careful with that, or you might want to look into buying a third party or an add-on shock mount if you have a tendency to bump your microphone stand. I also find, including on my voice, that the higher frequency response can be a little bit harsh on sibilant voices like mine. So you're either going to need a de-esser or you might want to look at other microphones. As I mentioned, the price of the microphone is $450 US at the time of this review, and it's actually been that price for a number of years now. How does it compare to something like the SHURE SM7B? And I want to first say, these are just my own impressions. This starts to get very, very subjective very quickly. I don't really believe that there's such thing as an objectively best microphone, so I would disabuse yourself of that notion if you were kind of thinking of it in those terms. So overall, here are my impressions of the RE20 versus the SM7B. I prefer the darker sound of the SHURE SM7B. It's not as sensitive in the higher frequencies for voices with a lot of sibilance, like my own. On the other hand, I prefer the RE20 on most other voices. It has an overall crisper, brighter sound to it, which I think works really, really well. I will say that the RE20 doesn't require as much gain, so It requires about 4 dB less gain on the same voice at the same distance versus the Shure SM7B. So it's not, you still need a very good preamplifier that can supply at least 60 dB of clean gain, preferably 65. I'm running it at 62 here. So that's a nice thing. You don't need quite as much gain, but you are still going to need a good, strong preamplifier to make this work well. If I could only choose one of these microphones, well, good news. I didn't have to choose. I've actually purchased both of them, the RE20 and the SM7B. I love them both, but for different reasons, as I just mentioned. On Danny's voice, I much prefer the RE20. On my voice, I prefer the SM7B. What about compared to microphones like the Earthworks ETHOS? The ETHOS is actually a much newer microphone. It's also a condenser microphone. It's my favorite microphone for live streaming. However, with that microphone, because it's a condenser, you generally are going to pick up a little bit more ambient sound in the room, in the space around you. You work a little bit farther away from it, and so it's going to have a tendency to pick up a little bit more of what's going on in the room. So if you are working in a space that does have some noise, that's where I think something like the RE20 or the Shure SM7B will probably be a better choice. You generally have to work up closer on those, and as a result of that, your signal-to-noise ratio is different. You're getting more signal because you're closer. So that's kind of the difference between those. But if you are working in a very quiet space, I do very much like the Earthworks ETHOS on my voice, at least. What about compared to the Electro-Voice RE27ND? I've never used that microphone. However, what I can say about it is that on all of the samples that I've heard for spoken word, it just sounds a little too bright for my personal taste. That doesn't mean you have to feel the same way about it if you feel differently. There are people that love that microphone. I think that's great. I think it's probably going to be better suited to much darker voices that don't have a lot of high frequency energy in them. It will help them to sound a little airier, a little bit more balanced. But on my voice, absolutely not interested in that microphone. And to me, it just sounds a little too brittle. So that's my overall just purely subjective observation. So overall, the RE20 is a rock-solid dynamic broadcast mic with a rich bass response and a crisper, higher frequency response than you typically find on most dynamic microphones. Really rock-solid microphone, works well on many voices, and should last your entire career. If you want that rich broadcaster sound, the RE20 is an excellent choice for voices without too much sibilance. So there's our look at it. Now, we do have some other microphone reviews, broadcast microphone reviews, that if you're interested, we'll put a link to those both up here if you're on a desktop computer watching on YouTube, or down in the description if you prefer. What you can do is pull those up in a separate browser tab, and you can actually play them back and forth if you want to hear those other microphones compared to this. We've normalized them to the same level so that you can compare them without problem. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.